Hi, everybody. You can even see from your quick reaction the spirit of Skoll. This is my first Skoll. I've told some of you, I think my colleagues have been keeping this secret from me. It's an amazing community, and there's so much optimism. I literally got my badge here a couple of days ago, and I went to a side event, and I saw people wearing their badges dancing. I said, what is going on at this conference? And that's, I think, a lot of what I find here is the sense of opportunity and optimism. We're going to correct that in this conversation today. We're going to think about like what's really going on outside of Oxford and the challenging, I guess, fragile times as the panel is described that we are all living in. And we're going to have the opportunity to hear from two people who are at the center of this, and hopefully we'll share some of their candid thoughts about what do we do given those realities. I mean, this is a time when the United States and Canada are fighting, when the Nobel Peace Prize has become a bargaining chip between countries. It's a time when the BRICS are banding together and developing their own payment systems, when there seems to be a whole new geopolitics of spheres of influence. It's a time when U.S. democracy was recently downgraded by an organization that studies these things and listed as an electoral democracy, down among others that are not seen as fully democratic. So we're in a moment when, as all of you in this room know, I think, some long-held assumptions we've had, including about the countries where a lot of the development aid comes from, some of those long-held assumptions are falling apart. They're breaking. And I think it's causing people in this room and elsewhere to ask themselves some pretty existential questions, and especially leaders, about what do they do in that moment. And I think it's part of the reason you, Heather, got the role that you got at the Ford Foundation. Heather Gerken is next to me, the new president of the Ford Foundation. How many months in are you? 4 months. I feel in a way that Heather was sort of created in a laboratory for this job. She is one of the world's leading thinkers on the law of democracy and on constitutional law. I wonder why they picked you for this job right now. You have done a lot of work on actually thinking about what makes a good democracy, what makes a good electoral system. You wrote a book about it. You've developed a scorecard, a ranking system for thinking about electoral systems and voting. So we'll hopefully talk a little bit about those kinds of things today. And next to Heather is my good friend, Ndidi Nwuneli, who is the president and CEO of the One Campaign. Yes. Ndidi is like behind everything good that is happening in this space, as all of you know. I just follow behind to see what's going on. Where Ndidi is, there's probably something exciting and innovative happening because she represents, too, a lot like Heather, the moment that we're in, because you came as a social entrepreneur into this role. You, back in Nigeria, have developed companies and social enterprises that I think reflect a lot of what many people in this room are trying to do now, which is to find these places where you can bring capital and impact together. You've been doing that your whole career. You're also on the board of the Rockefeller Foundation, so you know this space that Heather is entering well, too. So I guess I want to start maybe with you, Heather. We're not going to stay on U.S. democracy all day, but I think we kind of have to start there. So how do you see the moment the United States is living through right now?
It's a great question. First, I just want to give a huge shout out to Skoll and the entire staff. This is also my first Skoll, and it has just been amazing. And so just to say thank you for inviting us and for doing all this work. So U.S. democracy, I mean, I actually was charmed by fragile times because almost every panel I'm on is challenging times, unprecedented times, all of those things. So we're in a moment of real stress in the United States. These are not something that's sui generis. This is something that has been affecting everyone all at once in different forms. But I will just say I did not expect to spend so much of my time at this moment thinking about just protecting the basic work of the election system, protecting election administrators so that they can do their jobs. That is not something that I would have expected. I've been doing democracy work all of my life, but it's been mostly on the affirmative reform side, not on the defense side. The opportunity to come do it at Ford, though, is just extraordinary because Ford has this amazing history. So in the 50s, during the McCarthy era, It was standing up protections for free speech and dissent against enormous pressure. It helped fund large parts of the civil rights movement. It helped fund a lot of the work in South Africa against apartheid. It helped build the backbone of the human rights litigation system inside the US, the public interest litigation, and that is all under enormous stress. So I am an optimist. I think that there is a real danger in some senses that because in the US people have not experienced this as much as many of our peers across the world, that we're getting buffeted by it. And that is a terrible mistake. We are early in this fight. We are going to win this fight. But the key is not to psych ourselves out of this fight. So there's a lot of work to be done. But I am optimistic about our ability to do it.
I'm optimistic too. When you say we're going to win it, I want to ask the question maybe some people here are thinking, which is we've got an election, a midterm election coming up in November. Are you confident that will be a free and fair election in the United States?
Well, I've bet $60 million on that in the last 2 months alone. So I should just say I started a very short time ago, but have been using the discretionary reserves I have to build out protections. And so am I confident that it won't be under pressure? No. It is clearly going to be under a set of pressures that it hasn't experienced. But do I have enormous faith in the people who are doing the work? Yes. And I should just say, I think that work tends to be invisible to people, even just the election system. I love this stuff, but up until recently, I'm the only one. It's boring, right? The nuts and bolts of how an election administrator runs the system. But I will say that what's really given me faith is the fact that so many people from the left and the right have been doing the basic work of making sure election administrators can do their job. I think also people don't realize how many backstops there are along the way to protect the system. So there's a lot more protection inside the system than there was even in 2000, which was the last big kerfuffle we had with the election system. So do I think there will be attacks in the free and fair election? Yes. Do I think we will get through them? Yes.
That's really good to hear. And Ndidi, your organization was co-founded by Bono. He famously would come to Washington, D.C., and he would somehow charm and win over the most anti-globalization, anti-international cooperation members of the U.S. Congress. And it worked. I mean, he created, not alone, but in partnership with many others who are here, really created a moment when there was bipartisan consensus in the United States and in Europe, too, around global development. And we saw 25 years, from the Jubilee campaign on, of this consensus generating more financial flows, commitments like the Sustainable Development Goals. So you have to live in the same way Heather does in this new world. How do you see it right now, this world that you're in today? Because you're back on the Hill these days, having those conversations that Bono used to.
So thank you so much, Raj, and it's an honor to be on this panel with Heather and someone I admire greatly, Raj, who is actually showing a lot of courage in Washington alongside one campaign. I would say that it is a tough time. And I think the first few months of the administration, our sector was almost in chaos. What are we going to do? We were reactive. But I think we've come to a place where we're recognizing, like Heather, that this time requires courage, it requires wisdom, and it requires partnership like never before. But the type of courage has to be rooted in the right alliances and sometimes not a different type of intervention. So at one, we've actually activated our faith communities, not just in the United States, but across the world. We've created a global faith council. Faith leaders are able to walk into rooms that many of us cannot. And we've seen a faith leader most recently from somewhere in the European region, yes, showing a lot of courage, right? Faith leaders. We've also created a Diaspora Creative Council, and diaspora voices in media, entertainment, fashion, sports are starting to speak out in their communities. And our youth and our community members are still very powerful. And so while on face value it seemed like the cuts were going to be significant, we've actually defended the cuts in many, many, many spaces, especially for life-saving medicines and humanitarian. And for that, I would say I'm proud of what we have done as a sector and what many of you have done with us. Has it been easy? Absolutely not. Are there people who still care across both sides of the aisle? Yes. But they're not as loud as they have been in the past, because PEPFAR was created during the Iraq War. Bush was Republican, it was bipartisan support, saved 26 million lives, and one was solidly behind the advocacy of that work. And we're proud of that moment. It was a tough moment. We believe this is the same time to create interventions, but with a different mindset, one that is linked to sustainability, ownership on the ground, voice from the people, shifting power like we've never done before, and actually activating new forms of partnership that are not North-South alone, that are not South-South alone, but actually grown from countries where people are demanding the type of rights and responsibilities they deserve.
I want to talk about that new vision in a moment, but just first, because you spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill and you talked to both sides of the aisle, do you see opportunity in this moment? Like, do you think that we are forced into a paradigm where there are those who believe in international cooperation and those who simply do not, and that cuts down on party lines? Or do you think there are people you can work with in the administration on Capitol Hill?
Well, our team, and I believe there are people who we can work with. What we have recognized is that, frankly, a lot of people don't know what international cooperation is anymore. And we as a sector did not do a good job of educating everybody, including the voting public, about the great work that was being done. And we took it for granted. We were talking to each other at school. We were celebrating the good work here, but the average person on the street didn't know. And so we spent a lot of time, we've created a fellowship for young staffers to even understand what this work is. We just took some reporters to Sudan because we realized that the average American doesn't even know where Sudan is on the map. Sad to say, right? We've had to do a lot of what we did in the beginning, which is introduce people, show them what is possible, show them the great work that the UK, Germany, the US has done in the world, not just the negative stuff, but some of the good work that has been done through cross-sector collaborations. And that has really started changing mindsets. So there are some people, not enough, so I want to be honest, but we've realized that education, engagement has been critical, and we need to do more of it.
I guess, Heather, I want to get a sense from you. You're only 4 months into the job, but whether the worldview you bring to it and your understanding of the challenges the U.S. faces in terms of its fundamental rule of law and democracy, is that widely shared, do you think, by your peers and colleagues? Like, has this community absorbed in the way you have what this means? Or do you think that there's still a sense, well, this is a blip or a short-term issue, well, you know, it's an election like any other, we'll get through it? How do you think people in this community are responding to this moment?
I think there is a growing awareness of the importance of the rule of law. And to be fair to everyone, the rule of law is basically invisible to all of us. It's the underpinning of making everything work. It makes capitalism work. It makes democracy work. It makes governance work. But unless it's at stake, people just don't even notice it. They take it for granted. And I think it took people a little while to realize both that it was under threat and second, how important it is. So I do feel there's a growing coalition. And I just, if I can give a shout out to lawyers, you know, one of the things I've noticed is that I know you guys hate lawyers, right?
By the way, Heather was the dean of the Yale Law School.
Yeah,
I think you know that.
I trained a bunch of them, but let me just say one thing about lawyers, which is that, you know, you hate lawyers because we argue about everything, and that is absolutely the case. That's why no one wants to marry us. However, the thing about a professional tribe that argues about everything is that when you spend a generation arguing about everything, you suddenly realize there are some things for which there is no argument on the other side. That is the rule of law. So never mistake the rule of law for what you believe or want to be the law. The rule of law is something so basic that my friend Ben Ginsberg, who represented Romney and Cheney while I was representing Obama during the presidential election, you know, he is very different from me and his worldviews, but we can agree on what the rule of law requires. And one of the things that's been really moving about this moment is seeing how often it is that people on both sides are standing up for it. And even lawyers, we are hired guns on occasion, but also it's often lawyers that are putting themselves on the line when countries begin to slide into authoritarianism. That's unusual. Most elites don't put themselves on the line. And so I feel like people are coming to grips with its importance. It is also the high ground. So I just want to say, nonprofits and foundations are under attack all across the world, including in the United States. But free speech, the First Amendment, the freedom to give, those basic protections, that is something that unites a very large part of the sector and that is deeply intuitive to people. So I feel like we are finding our way exactly. Ndidi is exactly right. We need to build a bigger tent. We need to speak in a different way. We need more allies. That has been one of the paths for finding more allies when we talk about the rule of law.
Maybe can you just say a word, since you mentioned the funding you've already provided, some $60 million, thinking about these elections, like what kinds of things are you funding now at Ford with this conception you bring to the job that maybe the foundation wouldn't have funded before?
Yeah, and I should just say this builds on the last 10 years. We've put 1.1 billion with a B dollars into democracy work. So this is on top of that. So the kinds of things that we're funding, one is we're funding just rule of law litigation. So litigation is not a long-term democratic strategy, but it is something that really matters at this moment because it is holding back some of the worst things. It's preserving what's left of the administrative state, the separation of powers. It is protecting the communities that we work with, but it's also protecting everyone by slowing the pace of change down. And then the other piece of it is we are really working on the ground to prepare election administrators. So in the US, for those of you unfamiliar with the system, it's decentralized, mostly is not professionalized in the way it is in other countries, and it's underfunded. And so just to give you, there are 433 precincts in the state of Maine, which is teeny tiny in terms of population. So these are a set of people who often are volunteers, who are part-time, who haven't had the kind of formal educational training you see in other countries. And they are wonderful people, but they are not prepared for what might be coming.
Including like threats to their personal safety, which we saw in the last election.
So threats to personal safety, threats to the election systems, the fear of ICE agents showing up, the fear of FBI agents grabbing ballot boxes. There's a whole set of things that nobody really knows. But one of the things you can do is by working with election administrators, prepare them for what might be coming. And most importantly, reminding them that they have a community that is behind them. So a lot of the work we're funding is work inside the community with local lawyers and community leaders just to hold that community fast. Because somewhere, the way polarization works, the holy fires of hell will rain down on someone, and no one knows who it is. And what we need that person to do is do their job. And these days, that means to be brave. And so we're doing everything we can, providing whatever support we can, lawyering support, comm support, whatever it is that we need to help those folks negotiate what will be a challenging situation.
Yeah, and I think this is a theme maybe we'll come back to in our broader discussion. I want to bring all of you in with questions at some point. But I want to come back to you, Ndidi, on the way you sketched out kind of the new world we're entering when it comes to foreign aid and development. That, yes, the cuts were shocking, but you were never a fan of the old structure anyway, right? We used to talk about this a lot, and you would see it on the ground, the kind of market distortions that came from aid, the lack of focus on local solutions that would bubble up from the ground, and they wouldn't get funded. Maybe sometimes they'd be crowded out. I guess I wonder how you feel about some of the reactions to the Trump administration and the aid cuts in Africa, where a number of African leaders say, good riddance to USAID. We didn't like it. And some of them say, to me, we kind of like the fact that the Trump administration is really clear. They're just being transparent now about what the U.S. wants versus the way people used to talk, pretending it was all about values and high-mindedness. And at the end of the day, they also wanted our minerals, right? How do you respond to that ethos that you must experience, because you talk to world leaders and African leaders all the time?
Thank you, Raj. I would say that, to be fair, there are two camps. And when we think about ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, at one, we believe that we still need funds on the continent. And even on the continent, people still believe that we need funds for life-saving medicines and humanitarian in our most fragile countries. So countries like Sudan still need support. We cannot ignore countries that are at war or countries that are facing serious climate disasters. They do need support. So we'll put them in a bucket. But there are countries that are emerging economies that need investment. They need fair rules, fair trading rules. They need obstacles removed. They need fair financing. And this is the camp where you hear loud and clear that it's Africa's agency that needs to determine Africa's future. And I think both can coexist. I like the term, and a wise person once says, there's no sovereignty without solidarity. We still operate in a global ecosystem. And I'll give an example on the cost of capital, because one has been working extensively with many of you on the cost of capital. Most African countries pay 10 times, or 5 times more than their counterparts across the world for financing, for debt. And so we have 30 countries right now at the brink of debt distress, and some are already in distress. Now, why is this the case? A big portion of it is a risk premium that is unfair linked to investing in Africa. People still tell me, oh, Africa is a black hole. It gets too much money and the money is wasted. I hear that, it breaks my heart. Number one, we're a continent of 54 diverse countries. Every country is at a different stage of development, and there is evidence of growth. In fact, my team just came back from Ghana, and they said that the Ghana stock market was the best performing in the world last year. How many of you knew that? Or that IFC investment in the continent over the last 3 years generated 6x the S&P 500. Those stories are not told, right? And so for us, we've worked with many of you, and as South Africa hosted the G20, to say we must continue to fight to change narratives. We must put out alternative data. We must hold governments accountable as well as the rating agencies to ensure fairer financing, because we do need financing to drive growth. But the good news is the African governments and African private sector is also looking internally. The African Development Bank leader, Dr. Ndidi, alongside AFC's CEO, are saying, how can we unlock pension fund money, local and regional bank funding to ensure that we can finance ourselves, because we can't wait for anyone else to finance us. And so that work is being done locally, and then we also need global actors to partner with us to ensure that we reduce the cost. So that's an example, because for that growth to happen, you need global solidarity. You need rules to change. The data we released as part of the spring meetings, I don't know how many of you have seen it, shows that between 2020 and 2024, the cost of debt to Africa went up by 91%. Not just from China, but even from the World Bank and IMF, the organizations that we are fighting for. So we have to hold them accountable. This is unacceptable. At a time when debt costs should be going down, they're going up. And so for me, that's an example of sovereignty required, growth required on the ground, but we need countries and governments and bilateral, multilateral institutions to behave fairer and to treat our continent as a return on investment and not a risk.
But you don't want to go back to the way things were.
Absolutely not. I don't want to go back to the way things were, but we're also entering another scary era. And I'll use the US as an example. So you mentioned critical minerals. I'm sure many of you have been talking about the health MOUs that I think at the last count over, 26 countries had signed these bilateral MOUs with the US government, which for us are quite worrisome. Because now the US is saying, okay, we're not going to go through USAID or through other agencies to give money. We will give you, let's use an example. Kenya will give you $1 billion, but you have to give us long-term data coming out of your country. You have to commit to spending maybe 500 million, and I'm using these numbers as an example, and you have to show us progress, otherwise we take back our money. And these MOUs, in many cases, we are seeing governments having to scramble to demonstrate to the US that they're going to buy products, they're going to buy equipment from the US. And when I hear ambassadors in DC telling me I had to bring in 3 containers of cotton from the US before I could have a meeting at the State Department, that is that's the wrong direction. It's transactional. It's actually, I don't know what word to use. That's taking us.
We want to know what she was really thinking
No,
there.
I'm not going to get into trouble like Heather. But the point is we have to be alert as countries. We must think generationally about what we're committing our countries to, and we must continue to fight back to ensure a fair playing ground. And for me, some of those MOUs should never have been signed, and I applaud some of the countries that have negotiated better terms for their people.
And thinking about lawyers, Heather, it's a little unclear to me, those health compacts, what the kind of, under what governing authority they exist. And one of the things we hear a lot is that African countries may be signing them because they're not really sure what they mean long-term anyway, and they think we might as well play in this game and see. Congress normally appropriates, and these are kinds of appropriations in a way with strings attached that have not been approved by Congress. So that will be an interesting question to see how it ultimately plays out in the next year or two, I think.
Yeah, and I will just say that is true of, just a reminder, sometimes when you sign something, you say it's an EO, an executive order, that does not make it law, right? It's no different than a tweet in some instances, unless there's actual legal authority beneath it. And I think it's easy to get confused about that. I'm sympathetic, but we should also remember that so many of the things that we're worried about are actually not legal.
You had your first overseas visit, speaking about Africa, to Nigeria.
Yeah, I did. It was amazing.
You're coming to this job with very much a U.S. background and focus. Ford works all over the world. What are you thinking about what you'll do, what your strategy might evolve into? I know you're early in the role, but having experienced meeting your grantees in Nigeria and starting to think about what your international focus might be.
It's a great, I will say, it was that trip was astounding. It was in some ways my first time to really get to see work of grantees because I had just started the job. But Ford will remain a global foundation. It is one of the most glorious things about the program is that we do work in two places and they mutually reinforce and inform one another. So we are going through a refresh like everyone else, not because I'm a new president, but because we are in a new moment in time. And everyone is thinking about the question, which is, where do we go from here? Because in some ways, at a moment like this, any institution that has power, no matter what form it takes, but including financial power and reputational power and intellectual power, has a moral obligation to figure out how best to spend those resources. Because there aren't enough resources. There's too much good work that needs to be funded, and there's not enough money to fund all of it, at least at this moment, until we unlock some of the private capital that's out there. So we are all having to think about the hard question of what is it that we do best and where are we most impactful. And so we are in the midst of thinking about that. And part of thinking about that is also thinking about how, at least for a traditional foundation like Ford, how do we meet the moment? Because we are built for the long term. We're built for expertise. We're built not to chase headlines. We're built to do field building work. Those are all virtues. And yet, this is a moment where being able to pivot, being able to move quickly is also extremely important. And we're doing it. One of my folks on my staff said, it's a really bad time to do refresh because no one knows the answer to any of these questions. And that's exactly it. That is, we need to think about how to create a foundation that's going to be able to help our grantees, help ourselves think through these problems at this moment. So that's a challenge. It's a big challenge, but it's also kind of an amazing moment to be there. So we are thinking the same things for our global work as we are for our domestic work. How do we think about where we can be most impactful in this astounding moment? How do we meet a moment that is an unusual one?
Well, and as you said earlier, what the United States is going through in terms of its democratic weakening is not only happening in the United States.
Well, I will just say anyone from the U.S. who's whining should stop and go abroad, because one of the things that has just been so amazing about people dealing with just astoundingly large challenges is, in meeting both our grantees and our teams, they are unfailingly optimistic. They are unfailingly strategic. They are finding ways to do good work even in systems which are even more challenging. And so that, to me, is a model. I think in the olden days, Ford used to understand itself as going out to teach the world for better or for worse. But I feel like we have so much to learn right now from our global partners and from our many regional offices, because they are now teaching us how to work through this moment.
Ndidi, maybe we can stay on this theme about philanthropy, because that's, so many philanthropists are here at Skoll, big and small, individual philanthropists, legacy foundations like Ford and like Rockefeller, where you sit on the board. And I feel like philanthropy is going through a bit of an existential crisis itself, trying to figure out where does it fit in this moment and in this world. Kate, you deal with philanthropies all the time at One, right? Take us behind the discussions. Like, what are people inside, in the foundation world, thinking right now? What are some of the tensions? The grantees, many of whom are in this room too, tell me, boy, this is a tough moment, because every foundation we talk to says, we're going through a rethink about our strategy. And the organizations are saying, we need funding now. Don't you know that foreign aid just got cut? But yet, you can see it from the perspective of the foundations who say, it's a different world. We have to be ready for it. So take us inside the thinking a little bit that's happening among foundation leaders.
Well, I can't profess to have everything that you're going through, Heather, because I'm sitting on a board is very different from being the CEO of a foundation. But I would say three things that have struck me. I think number one, the recognition that even if you make long-term bets or allocate funding for long-term bets, which we see foundations have, you have to have a significant amount of money that is flexible enough to react to the needs of the moment. Saying that, oh, we finished our budget for the year, there's nothing left for this, for me, is not acceptable today. And I think on all the foundation boards I sit on, I've made it very, very clear that that's something we have to continue to. Because otherwise, you're not meeting the moment, you're not listening to the grantees, and you're not able to respond quickly. Sometimes it's the president's office, and a few of the president's offices have a big enough share, but we actually need it in every single node of an organization with clear guidelines of how it must be used. The second, I really see some trends, but not enough, is the need for foundations to partner at the country level. Honestly, it's been the most frustrating thing, and I'll say this, even when I worked as a social entrepreneur in Nigeria, I saw it, and then all the way up. I remember one major foundation asked us to do a mapping of all the funding that was coming into agriculture. And not only was it extremely complex, but even that foundation did not know all the funding that was coming to that country, because some of its funding was going through, multi-pooled funding. And yet, they did not talk to other foundations. And then we have people all supporting the same donor darlings, the same very creative marketers, and saying, oh, because Ford funded them, they must be legitimate, so I'll fund them. And they're missing some of the gems on the ground who are working so hard, delivering results, and can't get any funding. And they're closed out. So for me, that partnership and that collaboration needs to enable not only a good mapping of where the resources are, but where the gaps are and where the ecosystem changes need funding. And we're not seeing enough of that. The need for attribution gets in the way, right? And I love the quote that says, it's amazing what we can accomplish if we don't care who gets the credit. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, we are still stuck in my program, my intervention, my big bets, call it what you want. We're seeing some bright lights, and we're seeing, I'll use Rockefeller as an example. M300 for me is exciting because it's the African Development Bank, it's the World Bank, it's Rockefeller, and many other partners coming together. GEP was another example, but they're not enough. And we see, Beginners Fund, maybe that's an example, but I don't see enough. I don't. And I think in health in particular, I'm quite worried that we don't have enough partnership and collaboration. And then the third thing I would say, and this might be tougher, but I heard it from a social innovator from this group, and he said, let us focus on scaling what works, not scaling our work. And for me, foundations continue to scale work that they feel like is their footprints, whether it's working or not. I'm being honest about the data, being honest about the impact on the ground and the ownership on the ground, and the sustainability pathway from inception. We have to do better. We don't have a minute to lose $1 wasting funds on things that are proven that they're not making a difference or that there's no ownership on the ground. Let's use every pound or dollar we have to deliver impact for the most vulnerable.
And I think social entrepreneurs are getting there too, or maybe they're already there. Many that I've met at this conference, right from the start, they say, well, we've thought about how government will one day fund this program. You know, they've thought about how they're going to get different stages of finance from grants, but then eventually from earned revenue as part of what they're working on. So I think maybe the foundations are the last ones to this party, but a lot of the social entrepreneurs are there. I wonder what you both think about the fact that there is so much more money coming into philanthropy. You know, think of the Silicon Valley money. We're going through this AI revolution. A number of the major leaders of that AI revolution are avowed philanthropists, effective altruists, and we're expecting many billions to get donated through them. But you've got lots of others. The Buffett family has $150 billion to give away. I mean, there's lots of new money coming in the space. What do legacy, traditional foundations like Ford, like Rockefeller, that have built up an incredible history, expertise, a brand, but are relatively small now? You know, there was a time when you were the biggest foundations, but are relatively small now. What does that mean for how you play in this space?
It's so interesting, Raj, because I came from the nonprofit side, so I was a fundraiser. And when I interviewed with the board, I never mentioned that I was good at fundraising because it seemed totally irrelevant to the job. And then basically day 2, I realized, oh, my job is to be a fundraiser. That is maybe the most important thing that I'm doing. And just to affirm what you said, what the legacy foundations can offer is effectively the good housekeeping seal of approval. Because a lot of the organizations you're talking about, they don't have an infrastructure, and they need it. And so, and again, I just want so much of what you said just resonated with me. So we have a whole series of people that we're funding in the democracy space, and boy, have we vetted them. I'm a lawyer. C3, C4, the 30 state laws that prevent you from, we've talked to people's GCs, we did everything. And now I have a list, right, of really terrific opportunities. I share it with everyone. I don't care if we get any credit, right? What is important is that we all put our money in as quickly as possible to support that work. And so you're exactly right in the way that you describe what gets in the way. But I do think that, especially for the legacy foundations, innovation, being able to provide that good housekeeping seal of approval, being able to provide a set of services and support that actually other foundations just cannot. So I am an enormous fan of the Ford's Build program. I think the first thing I said to the trustees, other than please fund the rule of law and democracy during my first interview, was you should build on Build. And the reason why Build matters, for those of you, it's a longer term grant making, bigger grants, long-term grants, and support. Is because it provides what institutions need at this moment to maintain their resilience. It's extraordinarily important. That's the kind of thing that we can provide, not just a check. And so I think there's opportunities for the legacy foundations, even though our footprint is relatively smaller, still to continue to push forward the work in a way that matters.
Can I just give a shout out to Build? So Leap Africa I'm the founder of Leap Africa,
yes.
is a Build beneficiary, and it actually made a huge difference. So for how many Build people do we have in this room? See?
Yeah.
It's amazing because it ensured the
amazing.
sustainability of the organizations and strengthened them. So well done.
Yeah, and I should just say the other part about Build that's so magic, and you really see it with our grantees, you know, it's just the right way to do philanthropy in my view, and I say that as someone who's been on the other side of it. But also at this moment, if you want people to be nimble, the people who are our Build grantees with big sustaining grants are much more nimble. They're not tied to some project that they cooked up 2.5 years ago, right? That isn't really relevant anymore. They're able to take the funds that we provided, which are stable and longer term, and use them for what they need to meet the moments.
And unrestricted.
And unrestricted,
Please
exactly.
underline the word unrestricted.
100%. I mean, that is exactly why. So if we want to be nimble, but the most important thing is that the people on the ground doing the work are nimble, and that requires unrestricted, long-term, sustaining funding.
Yeah, it's part of what you said earlier, but kind of giving up credit, attribution, giving up control, finding partners, trusting them, letting them go from there. I want to bring everybody into the discussion. So there are microphones that are going to come around. Hopefully you've got some questions or ideas. I'll give you a moment just to think a little bit more, and then I'm going to come and grab those, and I'll just take that moment as mics are moving around to bring back to the panel here the discussion about public advocacy. You said something earlier, Ndidi, that we kind of lost the public. You know, these are often elite conversations, including the one we're having now, right? what should we be thinking about differently to actually capture the public imagination? There was an era, not everybody wants to go back there, but Live Aid, you think about the Jubilee campaign that one did. There was an era when organizations in this community were out there actually building public support for the work. And it feels like that's gone. What do you think, both of you, about that?
Well, our North Star at One is very focused on children. And we believe across religions, across political divides, that everybody will agree that no child deserves to die before their 5th birthday. And so this commitment is saying that by 2045, through our work at One, we'll partner with others to reduce under 5 mortality by 50%, really galvanizes us. But that we will do this with countries that are fully eventually financing their own healthcare. So that ownership and accountability is key. Now, how do we get young people around the world excited? UK is hosting the G20. They have a development summit next week. Across the world, we're seeing people starting to galvanize around this idea. And I think it was actually Gordon Brown who said at one of my foundation board meetings, he said, everyone can agree that children should live full and healthy lives and should thrive. So can we find something that we can all agree on and use that as an anchor? The second thing that we're starting to see, and One has done a lot of creative polling data, is that at the district level, if you ask the average American, if your country spends $1 helping children in other part of the world or helping ensure life-saving medicines, would you be proud? Everybody, almost everybody agrees they'll be proud. Just $1 out of 100. And the UK is the same, Germany is the same. So if the contrary to the public opinion that people don't care, but it's how you phrase it. And so showing that their congressmen and women that data gives them confidence that they can vote for the right decisions and the allocation. So for me, it's about simplifying the language. It's about finding things people can agree on. It's about showing results and also showing that the funds are being utilized effectively and that there's a pathway to sustainability with ownership on the ground. And if we can do that better as a community and speak louder through other allies and through others who have credibility, I think we can make a lot more progress. We also have to hold governments accountable on the continent. So similar processes, our Africa team is building out. And I'm really proud to say we're seeing in Senegal and Sierra Leone a lot of optimism and engagement on this vision that we've laid out.
So maybe instead of 17 sustainable development goals with 170 indicators, just children? That's
children.
Simple. What do you think, Heather?
I agree with so much of what you just said. And I would say, coming from the academy, I was surprised by how similar the language is in philanthropy to what I think of as really unusual. I'm a simple, I word things simply. I think if you have an idea and you can't state it simply, it's not an idea. And so it was a little bit startling to discover language which was just as complex in this world as the other. Sometimes I hear the word narrative, and there's two kinds of narrative, right? There's the narrative where we just go out and tell people what we want them to think, and that is not narrative that's effective in any way. And the other is listening and engaging with people with whom you disagree. And so, I'm with you. There are things where there are sources of common ground, but you have to be a bridge builder. You have to be having those conversations. You have to be having those conversations with humility on your side and respect for the other side. And if you aren't doing that, you are never, ever going to be able to move this. So we need to think about the stories we tell, and they need to be simpler, and they need to involve listening first and telling less.
Thank you. Well, let's go now to hopefully some provocative questions and thoughts, and giving you plenty of time, so we've got lots of hands. All right, you've got the mic, Cece. Here, we'll start right here, and we're going to take 3 or 4, maybe even more, as a first round. And just tell us who you are, if you would, and then ask your question. Keep it as brief as you can, please.
I will do my best. Hi, everybody, and thank you to the panel for such amazing insights. My name is Pastor Mayo Gola. I'm from Kenya, and I coordinate a network of next-generation foresight practitioners in Africa. Given that we're living in a world that is very fragile, we are also experiencing the youth quake in a very interesting way. We now have a generation of under 35s who are very brilliant, well-educated, and very thirsty to see a better world across all sectors, and they're ready to shape the difference that we need in the world. Now, somewhere in the region I come from, the Gen Z protests since 2024 have been an issue arising in Kenya, Tanzania, Morocco. There are so many countries, even outside the continent, that we've seen this. And this generation of young people are really saying business as usual is not working, and we need better leaders, and we need a generation of new leaders who are capable to move us from the fragile times to better desirable times. Now, and maybe this question is for you, Heather. When the Gen Z protests broke out in Kenya, the movement was tribeless, leaderless, and partyless, speaking to some of the democratic issues that we need to see a difference on. And when some of the Gen Zs were killed on the streets, the blame needed to be put on someone, and the philanthropic sector was accused of that. Now, my question is coming.
Please, please.
Now, given that when we lead such campaigns for change, especially as young people, our lives are at risk, right? And therefore, we have decided to find other strategies that still get us our rights and the future we desire without having us lose our colleagues in the midst of fighting for a better future for not just ourselves, but the not yet born and the not yet voting. And that's why we use foresight as a scheme of how we do the work. The question is coming. In Kenya, now we've re-strategized as youth. We're no longer doing the protests. However, we're mobilizing our youth in Kenya to register as voters so that we can vote out all the leaders who have not done anything for us over the past couple of decades. And we're doing this through a campaign called Tuko Kadi. Tuko Kadi is Kiswahili, meaning that we have the voter's card. Now, the question is still coming.
Please, please, please. We'll have to get you a chair on stage soon.
We're doing this without any funding because remember, we're tribeless, leaderless, and partyless. And that means we're using our own resources as young people to do this. And the reason why we're doing this is because after the philanthropic sector was accused of funding this movement, we had no other choice because we feel like there's no more appetite and interest to support the young people in fighting for a better future and becoming the next generation of better leaders. Now, is this true? And is there still room for the young people to look to some of the private funding that is needed to push this work forward? And I'll close with one sentence comment. The reason why this is important is because now, as we're doing this campaign, in Kenya we have 1 million new youth voters who are registered and ready. And we're doing this campaign to have more numbers. But what we're seeing is the parties are now coming and giving us free money so that we can push those youth to vote for them in the next election. So what role is there for philanthropy such as Ford Foundation and One Campaign to support the young leaders? Thank you. It's over.
Thank you, thank you. All right, we're going to have to keep the questions a little shorter than that, guys, to get through enough. I'm going to let you answer that one first since it was lengthy. Please go ahead.
And I deal with law professors who give a very long speech, and then some of them will just say question mark at the end. So, I mean, if I can just speak generally about it. So you're right that philanthropy has been under attack in various ways because of the work they support. That's true in the United States as well. I'm actually of the view that the key to being a philanthropist is not to be buffeted, to keep sailing the ship. And so when I started my job, I knew we wanted to do rule of law and democracy work. I wanted people to know that Ford was in the field and not leaving the field. I think that's extremely important. The other thing I will just say is, one of the things that Ford has done for many generations and continues to do is really think about what it means to protect civil society. At different moments and different times, it takes different forms. But one of the forms it has been taking these days is protecting members of civil society from attack, whether that means early warning systems or providing legal support, communication support, security. And we're not the only foundation in the field that is doing this work, but it is extraordinarily important for every generation. The last thing I'll just say quickly about, there were so many pieces of that question, I don't want to leave it hanging, but I don't know if there has been a conversation I have had with any of our regional offices where the question about youth is not center square. because, and just purely from a democratic standpoint, young people are a source of enormous engagement and creativity. And also it is a democratic risk, in particular at an economy like this, to have a large number of unemployed youth. That is, if you want to map democratic risk, that's one of the most important things. So people are thinking very hard at this moment about how to support youth all across the continent.
Yeah, democracy has to deliver too, right?
Yes, well, I
Can't
will
just
say,
be theoretical.
yes, it's got to be capacity.
So thank you for your good work. We actually have just launched One Academy, and it's really focused on helping young people build the skills and tools to advocate for their rights. But protest is just one of the many, many tools that you have available. And for the last 22 years, One has been doing this all over the world. So would love to follow up and partner. There is hope, and there are people who want to work alongside you to deliver impact.
Okay, there's a lot of hands, I know. We're going to go to this gentleman in the red sweater, and then over here, and then right there.
Thank you.
And I'll ask you to please keep them, tell us who you are and keep them very brief.
It will be quick. My name is Fernando Travesi. I'm the director of the International Center for Transitional Justice. Thank you for the presentation. Quickly, I would like to hear your reflections in these fragile times protecting democracy. What are your thoughts or approaches about fighting the networks of corruption that are undermining democracy, all these systems of corruptions that are at the public and private sector? And second question is, what the accountability systems can you imagine or are working for to bring people accountable?
Okay, you can just pass the mic right behind you. We'll take that one first, and then we'll come back here.
Hi, I don't know if you remember, we met when I was a lawyer in New York. I wanted to thank you. I'm Moshmi Khan. I'm a recovering lawyer, but was most recently U.S. rep on the ADB board for Biden administration. But what I wanted to ask, I've heard and I very strongly believe your points about rule of law, and I was a lawyer in New York on 9/11, looking and doing poll watching and all of that before 9/11, the late 90s. The one word that I'm really missing from this conversation that's extremely vital is community. And I want to ask you to really push you to really talk about community, because I'm back home now in my home state of Michigan. And if we don't have that sense of, community, there's been so much dehumanizing as a Muslim, as a, an Asian, all of these things. People are not eating cats and dogs I've ever seen. And so I'd like to really talk about, I'd like to hear you talk about and to fund really more community building. But again, to your point about kind of global, and just one quick anecdote because it's related to both of them, is I was a very young lawyer working for Interaction many, many years ago. And when I did the first foreign policy day, and exactly to the point that people don't realize it's 1% of, not even, right, of foreign aid. So if we can kind of, broaden the communities global, what happens in the US directly impacts what happens other places. So that's the one word I would ask you to talk about.
Thank you. And then right here.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk today. My name is Ilana Aquino. I'm with the Carter Center, and I direct their conflict resolution program. Two quick questions. One is, my colleague from the Rule of Law program talks about this idea of lawfare, warfare, but laws, and where authoritarianism is being consolidated, the lawyers are often the first, and we saw that happening. Do you feel that there's some validity about that? And if we frame it in the sense of lawfare, that there's an attack, does that change how we need to approach what's going on? Second, quick question, shift the power. How do we have that be more than a slogan? We've done quite a good bit of work on locally led and this. How do we, in fragile times, to me, going closer, working with those who are most proximate to issues is going to be more sustainable? How do we actually make that real? Would you be open to, for example, reverse proposals where it's actually the community leaders who are putting out the RFPs and the call for proposals?
Thank you. And you don't both have to answer every question because we're going to try to get to another round here. But maybe, Heather, I can just start on this question of lawfare. Because, we have maybe people who have like minds on the stage. But there are people on the right in the United States who accuse the Biden administration and others of exactly that, of doing lawfare. So this has become like a battleground. And there are, again, people on the right who would accuse people on the left of being the ones who are reducing protections around elections. So how do you engage in these topics given that this is a contested space. Not everybody agrees with you, even on the very terms we're using.
Yeah, I appreciate all these questions, by the way, and I'm sure I've forgotten about half of them in the short time.
I'll remind you, don't
Yeah,
worry.
I should just say, because something contested does not mean that there isn't room for common agreement. So anything can be a source of contestation in politics. If we let that scare us, then we are not going to do the work that we should be doing. So, when I was starting, when a New York Times reporter said, but the rule of law, that's contested. It is contested, yes, but it is not contestable, right? So that is the key, is to sort of maintain our sense. And that does, I gotta say, you can't just say that, right? It's too easy to say that. If you are not in constant dialogue with people with whom you disagree on the other side of the aisle, to be able to find common ground. So it's good training to be a lawyer, right? Because lawyers need to know deep in their bones what's honorable about the other side's commitments and what's weak about their own. If you don't know that, you're not a lawyer.
Because if it is contested, that would include things like not following what a judge's order tells you to do.
Exactly.
And that can't be contested in the same way just an argument can be.
No, and just apropos of there are a whole set of guardrails that have been built out to avoid lawfare. There's always a danger of it, and there's excesses that happen in any administration period in a sentence. The key is to find the guardrails and to make sure that they stay strong and to have unity around them. And we're going to have to rebuild those guardrails just to ensure that we can do it. If I could just say a quick word about community to our lawyer writ large. I haven't, because of the topic, I've been talking a lot about the rule of law and democracy, but I just want to mention Ford has been astonishing at building community, doing work on the ground, and it matters enormously. So I'll just say one of the proudest moments of the last few months is hearing the work of our partners in Minnesota, which has really strong community, in large part based on a variety of groups there that have done astonishing work, some of whom we have been honored to support. Those were the groups that were delivering food to people's houses and finding doulas and picking up people at Dilley. The reason why Minneapolis responded the way it did is because it was a strong community. A strong community is based on having strong civic organizations that do that work. So we can talk about law all you want, but that nothing makes it meaningful unless it is built on the ground by human beings in a community.
Well, Ndidi, maybe you can pick up, please. Maybe you can pick up on Fernando's question about networks of corruption. You mentioned Sudan, but there are many examples. There's many countries where democracy is weak, and really what you have is sort of a network of corruption. You've got a system that is driving, what might seem like a legitimate government, but they're undermining a lot of the work that organizations like the ones you represent are trying to do. What do we do about that?
Yes, so that's what I was going to say. I was going to say the first thing is we're not going to say like Sudan. My friend Brian Kagaru, actually at the one's event during UNGA, said that he's ready to come and do capacity building for civil society in America on how to deal with corruption. So
Brian, he could probably solve it. I think he might.
Yes. So I'm just saying that, unfortunately, corruption is thriving in almost every country as we know it and getting worse. There are a couple of approaches we take, and a shout out to David McNair and the One Data team. I don't know how many of you saw our climate finance files and our climate finance hypocrisy, but it was actually the first time in the climate community where people had followed the money, not just the pledges, but where the money ended. And it showed that money that was supposed to be for climate ended in cafes in Italy and hotels in Spain and coal mines in other countries. So I think following the money and the power of data is critical. And we need enough courageous people who can follow the money. It will help unmask a lot of the initiatives. And another shout out to Mark Malloch Brown. I don't know how many of you read his newsletter, but he actually said that between January 1st and 20th, 2025, $500 million was paid by the US private sector for visits to Mar-a-Lago. Having that type of data, I'm quoting others so I can still get into the country, allows us to hinge our arguments on something. Now, that's not where it ends. That's where you need to then empower the advocates, the lawyers, the community, the citizens, to use that to basically elevate the scrutiny the voice, and the pressure. And that's why when the young lady from Kenya asked the question, I said, it's not just about protest, it's actually about empowering. And one community that I think really gets excited about this data is faith communities. We've been sharing some of this data with churches, Muslim leaders, Christian leaders, Jewish leaders, because these same people come to them to pray for them when it's an election season. And they're like, I didn't know this was happening. I didn't know my government took this loan. I didn't know there were 5, so empowering them to then hold their political followers accountable plays an important role. They also need scrutiny, so they're not devoid of that. And then the final thing I'll say for me is that when we think about corruption, and I want to tie it to another question that came in on what is really local, I think philanthropy has a role to play in strengthening local organizations. And for the boards I sit on, I say, what percentage of the local organizations, what percentage of funding actually goes to local organizations, not intermediaries? What percentage of the boards of those local organizations are made up of the local people? What percentage of the senior management are made up of the local people? And then you start seeing that the data shows you that, unfortunately, a lot of our philanthropists are still working very much at the surface, and we prefer to go through intermediaries. And with all due respect to my friends trying to raise intermediary funds and more system funds, I am not a big believer that that's what we need now. There are organizations on the ground delivering. We can help you find them. African Philanthropy Forum and others in the continent can help you. You don't need to go and create another intermediary fund. Because if we don't stand by local organizations and strengthen them, like you've done with Build, we'll continue to say that in times of crisis, we need to go through the international NGOs and the bigger organization. And that weakens the system and creates competition and distorts what we want to deliver on the ground.
That's a very live debate happening right now in this community. We've been covering it at Devex. Do you fundraise around a specific goal and gather funders together and then create these layers, or do you go direct? You'll hear more about this, I'm sure. By the way, Mark Malik Brown's better half is in the audience, so now you can tell him there's a lot of people here who read his newsletter. I do want to try to get some more questions in. Is that okay? I'd like to get as many as we can. So we'll go to this hand there. Yes, the mic's coming to you.
Thank you. I've spent the last 30 years of my life working at the grassroots, training communities in transparency and accountability processes through social audits. For the last few years, almost I think for a decade now, I actually find that grassroots level support for transparency and accountability initiatives have started dipping. And people are now telling us, funders turn around and say, oh, transparency and accountability, we're not really interested because, we would rather work with governments. I set up the first social audit society in India, and I headed it for 18 years before I quit 2 years ago to join the Barefoot College. But my question here is that I see transparency and accountability as the backbone of being able to access every right. Whether it's child rights, it's human rights, it's, preserving climate, and big data, yes, in terms of huge explosions come out, people love it, they read it, and they say, oh, this is what our leaders are doing. But what about that small trickle every single minute, every single moment, where a person who's supposed to be able to access her health right at a village level is not able to do it? And we find that it's almost seen as adversarial to ask questions of a government that has been elected and put into place. So I would really like to understand, not just with Ford, but with most, the conversation that I've heard around the last 1 week of social entrepreneurs, there's very little conversation around issues of transparency and accountability. And it struck me as very odd, because I would think that is the backbone of, every question that we ask in any room, in any space.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to try to squeeze as many as we can. We have one here, this gentleman. Thank you. And then we're going to come to you next.
Thanks to an excellent panel, and Raj, you're doing an excellent job. First to say, Heather, I'm a lawyer, and it's very rare in the development space to hear a shout out to lawyers. So thank you.
The lawyers have come out in force for you, Heather.
I see.
This is a variation of a question I asked yesterday. Swithin Munyantwali is my name. ILI's, South African Center for Excellence, we've been building legal infrastructure across the continent over the last 30 years. One of the comments I made yesterday at a panel was the fact, as you noted, that legal infrastructure development is invisible. How do you make it more visible and impactful during your tenure? And Ndidi, my good friend, if you could also share your view. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments, and shout out for the mediator that allows us to make as much questions as possible. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. So my name is Luana Genot. I'm from Instituto de Identidades do Brasil, working in the education and technology. My question is about democracy and how democracy are under threats in so many different parts of the world, from Brazil to Nepal, or in so many different parts of the globe. And combating inequalities, racial, gender, or caste, has proven benefits for democracy and the economy. Yet many foundations still treat these issues as high risk, and they are reframing the way they address them, right? Even if they are pillars for the democracies. So beyond data, because data has proven that those topics are connected to democracy and they do benefits for democracy. I would love to hear from all of you, how do we make investors or philanthropists to reflect and keep investing in these topics around the world, beyond the US? Hopefully.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the themes I've picked up at this conference so far is that with the collapse of foreign assistance, a lot of the people who work in direct service delivery, health, et cetera, they might have found other ways to gather money. I mean, their budgets have come way down, but they found that philanthropies might be willing to fund that. But if you're in the right space, or the democracy space, it's really tough out there right now. It's really tough. And maybe that gets to a couple of the questions, Heather, that we got. Our colleague from India talking about support for transparency and accountability going way down. Luana from Brazil saying the work on addressing castes and marginalized communities is seen as high risk by foundations. How do you think about this?
Yeah, I just wanted to affirm everything that you said. I mean, my first job as a lawyer was a giant housing desegregation case and doing voting rights work. And race was at the intersection of it, but it is deeply democracy work. And Ford, its original mandate from our kind of second founding was all about human flourishing and democracy, and rights are central to that. So this work of the civil rights movement was democracy work. And I'll just say, at a moment like this in particular, those issues are being used as a wedge to undermine democracy. So the attack on immigrants, racial attacks, I mean, just what's been happening on gender issues, they're a wedge to undermine democratic rights for everyone. So anyone who thinks that rights and democracy aren't interconnected, that social justice is somehow distant from democracy, is making a terrible mistake. And these are interlocking gears, right? Both of them are necessary to move us forward. And so, if I could just be dorky for just or dorky-er, for just one moment.
This is the right crowd.
Yeah,
please.
But I spent a lot of my time writing about election systems and federalism, right, which are big structural guarantees. I write about race and dissent. That was all my work. And everyone who worked on the right side of the law was, why are you writing about structural issues when you care about race and dissent? They are inherently intertwined with one another. You cannot make rights possible without democracy, and democracy is contingent upon rights. And if you aren't paying attention to both of them at the same time, you're making a terrible mistake.
Ndidi, pick up wherever you want. Go ahead.
So I wanted to I sympathize with all those who are working on rights, democracy, and that has propelled a lot of the work that I've tried to do on local philanthropy. And I'll just mention two things. At the One campaign, we've really tried to start galvanizing diaspora to come in and fund some of the work, not just for us, but on the ground. Because we believe in many contexts, diaspora can give small amounts, but it can make a difference. What we have to do is ease the process for them to give, and they are very interested in the rule of law and democracy. Remove the cost to remittances, and then remove any threats so that they can give anonymously or as a group. The second initiative that I helped create about 5 years ago is called Wealth for Impact, and it's my passion, which is helping early stage philanthropic families in Africa structure their giving. And they will prefer to give as a group to issues of democracy and rights, as opposed to individuals, because they don't want to be targeted. Many of their businesses will be exposed. And we're starting to see tremendous excitement across the board. So I'll encourage many of the leaders in this room to say, you actually have resources locally. While we love Ford and we love a lot of the global philanthropy funding, we need to show resilience in our ecosystems by putting pressure on our emerging elites and wealthy to give locally, to structure their giving, to give together, and create the systems and structures to show them results. And democracy and the rule of law is one they care deeply about, but they're too scared to give individually. So watch this space, and those who want to partner with us, please come and see me after.
When Ndidi says that, she means it, so this is going to be a real thing, I'm sure. Our colleague from South Africa talked about how some of this work is invisible. I think about the transparency and accountability work. Think about just the local media, even in the United States, and journalism. It is invisible until it disappears, and then you notice. Then you say, wait, this is a really missing and key component of our society.
And women are starting to fund. And we just saw with Mrs. Palmer, she just put in how much into the...
80 million.
80 million. And so I'm a big believer that with the wealth transfer going to women globally, that we're going to see a rise of bolder, courageous philanthropists who are female and who care deeply about these issues.
We're going to do a rapid fire set of questions because there's so many people who want to get in on this. We're not going to get to all of you. We're not.
People in the
but
back. Yeah.
Let's see. Let's go for, okay, this gentleman with glasses in the back has been waiting. And I'm going to come to you. You've been waiting a long time, I know. And then we haven't had anybody in the front row. So how about you in the center here? Go ahead, please.
Hi.
And please do keep it brief so we have...
Thanks, all. Matt Kavanaugh from Georgetown University. Very briefly, economic inequality. It's at the root of a lot of what we've been talking about. A bunch of our research recently showed that it's actually driving pandemics. It's driving the crises we have. It's linked to democracy, as a colleague was saying. How are you going to really tackle that? Because it seems at the root of some of what we're talking about, and it's increasingly hard to do. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Oni Chinedu, Executive Chair for African Food Changemakers, which is a community of 10,000 agribusinesses. My question is really around just advice. I'm going to dig into the topic, which is really about leading, during these precarious times. So, what leadership traits should all of us here be adhering to actually lead during this time?
Thank you. And then where was our last one? Here we go.
Thank you again. Ramsey Tom from the Blue Continent, Hawaii. The question that comes up with the conversation of democracy, well, we have many communities that are still dealing with decolonization principles, and are they equal? From the standpoint that there are communities that are looking to retain, restore their identities that have either been impacted by decolonization processes, dealing with legacy funding, legacy projects. What's the opportunity to shifting that to the opportunity with these communities being able to receive funding support to retain identity rather than becoming something that the legacy process requires them to change, if that makes any sense?
No, it does. Why don't we just start on that? I mean, the idea that you've got indigenous communities around the world who are sometimes forced into this global philanthropic model that we have. And, I talked to one social entrepreneur who said, I got some money from an international foundation because I'm really good at PowerPoint. But there's a lot of other organizations doing great work that aren't as good at PowerPoint, and somehow we've created these structures that are not necessarily funding the right things in the right places. Any quick thought on that? And we're going to end, by the way, just so you both wait, on this question of leadership. But a quick thought on that, if either of you have one.
Well, I would say it's a tough battle that we have to face, which is why I'm so committed to new sources of funding emerging and almost democratizing the funding. When you look at how faith communities have raised funding, it's individuals giving small amounts over time. And I just feel, honestly, and I love Ford and I love Rockefeller, and we depend on Gates and many others, that the power dynamic is really sometimes unsettling. And so I completely agree with you. From where I sit, I think there are two things. I think the younger generation is teaching us new ways of working. The technology that we have available to us, and Raj speaks a lot about how AI and the technology divide is creating distortions and also providing access and power to all of us. And that gives me hope, and how we use it to recalibrate the power dynamics in our world is really important. How we use it wisely is even more important. And then the third thing I'll say, and I really think the lawyers should come in here, the esteemed lawyer, is that ultimately we have to own our narrative. 2 years ago when I came to school, I think I heard the stories from this community and the power of storytelling about what we can learn from indigenous communities and the power that they have and the commitment to nature and the earth, and how learning and changing our mindset about where knowledge is stored and who owns knowledge and who owns the earth, that was mind-blowing to me. And I think more storytelling, changing narratives, and elevating new heroes in our community will be part of that struggle.
I'd love to get to Matt's question if we can. Matt Kavanaugh from Georgetown, who, it's interesting that he's asked about economic inequality, which was really the focus of your predecessor, right? Darren Walker at the Ford Foundation thought a lot about economic inequality. And he's right that it connects so much to what you're focused on and thinking about. So help us understand your thinking about that connection.
Yeah, I mean, so as we're going through our strategic refresh, one of the interesting things is as different parts of Ford have worked on social justice issues, almost all of them at some point have gravitated to economic inequality, and it hasn't been a category, and yet you see it all over the place. And boy, do I think it is important. Going back to the earlier question, economic inequality is the source of democratic instability. It's also just the right thing to worry about, and in some ways it grounds so much of the work that we're doing in other spaces. If you don't have that lens on it, it's really hard to see things for what they are.
Let's just end, because we need to wrap up, sadly. I know there's a lot of questions, and I appreciate the enthusiasm about this session. But to Oni's question about leadership, because this is quite a time to be in the chairs that you're in. You chose to take on this role leading a foundation that is, it's in the crosshairs, I guess you could say. And you're working on issues that are very prominent with leaders in the countries where you operate. Why did you decide to do it? And what do you think you're going to bring to this as a leader, as people in this community start to get to know you?
It's so funny, yes, because my friends ask me this question in a much ruder fashion. They're academics with tenure jobs for life, and why are you running from one burning building into another is the version of the question that they've asked. The answer is everything is on fire, and you need to suit up and get in the game. And I would say, it's so specific to the moment that you're in, because for me to give advice to someone who's facing much harder things than I'm facing, so I just want to name that. So maybe I'll just talk about philanthropy at this moment. Philanthropy is in a place of enormous privilege, so yes, it's under fire, but it is really in an extremely strong position compared to, I think, every single one of our grantees. Maybe that's not right, but I think, and it's easy to get wrapped up in your own concerns and forget how important it is to be focused on the people who actually have the greatest needs at moments like this. So one thing I would just say is that for, at least in philanthropy, we ought to really be focused on protecting grantees. Philanthropy needs to hold. It really needs to hold, because it is the source of so much. If you cut philanthropy off, you cut up a lot of the nonprofit sector. But we also really need to be conscious of the challenges that our grantees are facing. And the other thing I'll just say, and this comes from higher education, where there was some law, there was some money, there were some threats, but at the end of the day, too many leaders in higher education got buffeted, right? It wasn't that there was something in particular that was forcing them to do what they did. They did it because they got buffeted, because they weren't used to people being mad at them. They weren't used to bad stories in the newspaper. They weren't used to alumni being mad at them. And every sector is going to face that as time goes on. And people just need to learn to take a punch, right? And then keep moving forward, focus on the North Star, because the biggest weapon in the wars we are fighting writ large are being buffeted, right? It's efforts to buffet, because there aren't enough people to do all the terrible things that people want to do. So the key is to stand up and not be buffeted, I think.
Yeah, not acquiesce in advance, right? Ndidi, you took on your role. I remember it feels like yesterday. Again, knowing the challenges you're facing both in the world, the inequalities and the gaps that countries are facing, and also the political realities. Tell us, what do you think about as a leader in this moment? What are some of the traits, to Oni's question, that people in this room can take away?
Yes, the first one I think is that you must create a community of support. You are not alone. You cannot do this alone. It's draining emotionally, physically, and spiritually. So I have actively built a community of support in DC. Prayer warriors, people who pray with me, staying close to family who have provided support, but also creating family. I mean, Raj had the best welcome party for me in DC, so find friends like Raj. I would say the second thing is being very clear about what you can deliver at this moment and prioritizing what you can deliver. Otherwise, you're running in circles, being reactive instead of proactive, and making sure that your team is united, but also that you reach out to others in your ecosystem to have a united front. Because oftentimes with limited funding, we start fighting with each other, and the health community is special. This is my intro. I mean, agriculture was not this competitive. Health is. And I always have to tell people we're on the same side. We have a common enemy, poverty and disease. We are on the same side. And that commitment to saying we're on the same side, we have to work together, really disarms the threats and focuses us on what we need to do outside. And then the third thing I would say is the importance of, and this one is more personal, and I think the importance of knowing what you can juggle. A friend in DC says, you have glass balls and you have plastic balls. As you juggle, don't drop the glass balls. Don't drop the health. You need to sleep and eat. Don't drop the family. Family is really important. Faith is really important. The plastic balls, yeah. I mean, as I was coming back from London today, I missed a very important meeting. I forgot. It's okay. You know what I mean? You just give yourself the grace and say, I'm really sorry I missed the meeting. I woke up at 5 a.m. today. It's allowed. But that can drop. But there are some things that cannot drop. And I think as we continue to fight, because we need to fight. We need to be courageous. We need to have wisdom. We need to know that we also have to protect and enrich ourselves and pour into each other. And if I can add one last thing is celebrate the successes. Oftentimes we're so hard on ourselves, we forget that there are milestones that we have to recognize. We made it through this, we made it through today. My friend says, take it 1 hour at a time, sometimes, just to get through the day. And then you know that you can face tomorrow. And that's what holds us together in this ecosystem. But we're in it, and we have to demonstrate courage and wisdom every day.
I will not try to add anything to that brilliance from both of you. I'll just say that, we often focus on the institutions, but let's not forget the people. And the people behind those institutions, all of you in this room, I think that's one of maybe the lessons of the Skoll World Forum, this chance we get to spend real time with each other, that it's the people who are going to drive this change. So thank you all for being a part of this session. It's been a real honor to be with Heather and to be with Ndidi, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Raj.